all these eschatologies either say this or are indifferent to saying this, okay? They're not opposed to this, all right? So that's why I predict the odds that Mars will be destroyed because they need to build a third temple. Another thing in which they converge is the rise of anti-Semitism. Why? Because that will force the diaspora, the Jewish diaspora, to return to Israel. This is very important for this eschatology, okay? All right? Another important convergence point is the war of Gog and Magog. We don't actually know what this is, but this war is supposed to be the final war before the return of God, before the end of history, before the end of the world, okay? What this war is, we don't know yet. But another thing is that this war in Iran will lead to the war of Gog and Magog at some point, okay? What this war is, we'll discuss at a later time. Another thing that's very important is US and China are not part of this eschatology, okay? This is where everyone agrees. For whatever reason, the United States is not going to partake in future events. Neither will China, which means that something will happen to these two countries that will make them not significant anymore, okay? And the best prediction for the United States then is civil war, right? Okay, civil war. Okay, and this is where all these eschatologies converge. So in other words, this war in Iran is happening so that these different eschatological traditions can achieve heaven on earth from their perspective, right? So what this means, so given this convergence, we can actually predict certain events that will happen over the next 2 to 4 years, okay? Because they all want these things to happen together, all right? So let's look at some quick predictions. First prediction, of course, is that the US will use ground troops. Because using ground troops will create a national draft. And what does a national draft do? It creates a civil war, right? A lot of young people are going to refuse to fight in this war. And this is going to create protests. Then America will have no choice but to deploy the National Guard. And this will create the recipe for a lot of civil conflict in America, okay? Another thing that will happen is because you use ground troops, you will lose the war, and then CENTCOM, which is the American military in the Middle East, will then transfer over to Israel, okay? What's happening in this war is that the economies of the GCC are being destroyed, and that's part of the plan, okay? Because for Israel to achieve the Greater Israel Project, it needs to absorb the GCC and parts of Turkey and parts of Egypt, okay? So another way of saying this is that the GCC is basically finished. The intention is to collapse their economies and make them irrelevant, right? The third thing we can expect is that Turkey will enter this war, and Saudi Arabia actually, will enter the war. Because you want to use this war to weaken opposition to these eschatologies as much as possible, okay? So Turkey and Saudi Arabia will enter this war, and they will suffer tremendously because of their participation.